Hi, this is Mrs. Nagayama, your biology teacher, and this recording is to help you with quiz 2.14. Before taking this quiz, please read and review sections 2.12, 2.13, and 2.14. This unit is going to introduce you to the concept of macromolecules, which are large, important molecules that we need to live. We will be going over 4 different types of macromolecules: proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. Today we're going to be focusing on carbohydrates, which are the sugars that you consume. So before we go over carbohydrates, I wanted to go over the concept of monomers versus polymers. So monomers are basically smaller subunits of a polymer. So if I gave you the example of a monomer being a brick, then if we put a lot of bricks together or a lot of monomers together, we can build a polymer. In this case, it would be something like a brick house or a brick wall. So again, monomers are just smaller components or subunits of a bigger polymer. All macromolecules have monomers and polymers, and so for carbohydrates, I want to first introduce this idea by introducing another name for carbohydrates. Another name for carbohydrates is polysaccharide. And that might seem like a really complicated word when in fact it's not. We can just break it down a little bit. So the word saccharide actually means sugar molecule. So the word polysaccharide would mean many sugar molecules. So if you think about it like that, the monomer is always going to be something that's singular, only one. Mono meaning one. So the name that we have for the monomer for carbohydrates would be monosaccharide, meaning one sugar molecule. The polymer would just be poly in front of saccharide, which means many sugar molecules. So the monomer is monosaccharide and the polymer would be polysaccharide. So here's a sample question for quiz 2.14. This is an exact question from the quiz. What are monosaccharides made of? A, 1 sugar molecule, B, 3 or more sugar molecules, C, DNA and RNA, or D, proteins. We know saccharide means sugar, so we can eliminate C and D. And the word mono means one, so we can say that the best answer for this would be A, 1 sugar molecule. Here are some examples of monomers and polymers of carbohydrates. So remember, the monomer for a carbohydrate is called monosaccharide, made up of just 1 sugar molecule. So some examples of this would be glucose, fructose, and sucrose. Glucose is by far one of the most commonly known sugar molecules, and it's one that our body relies on heavily. We also have one called fructose, which is found in fruit, and sucrose that is found in sugar. Like the table sugar that you might have. But we're going to really focus on the monomer of glucose. Some examples of polymers would be polysaccharide. Some examples of polymers or polysaccharides would be things like starch and cellulose in plants and glycogen in animals and humans. So the cool thing about starch, cellulose, and glycogen is that they are all made up of glucose. So glucose is just 1 sugar molecule, but starch might have thousands of glucose molecules put together, similar to our brick with a brick wall, right? So if we put a lot of glucose molecules together, we can make things like starch, cellulose, or glycogen. So starch and cellulose are found in plants, and glycogen is found in animals and humans. And these polysaccharides are really important because they are made up of many sugar molecules and used to store extra glucose. So in plants, we store extra glucose in the form of starch. But in our own bodies, we don't store it as starch. We actually store it as glycogen. So here's a sample question directly from quiz 2.14. What role do starch and glycogen play in living things? Starch and glycogen are a direct source of energy for living things. B, starch and glycogen help living things digest food. C, starch and glycogen capture oxygen for respiration. Or D, starch and glycogen store extra glucose. So we know that B and C are not correct because we never talked about digestion or respiration when it comes to starch and glycogen. But A and D are probably the best two answers, but D is better because if you look here, we said that glycogen and starch are both ways that our bodies use to store extra glucose. So starch is for plants and glycogen is for animals and humans. So the best answer would be D, starch and glycogen store extra glucose. Here's another question. Which of the following are all types of complex carbohydrates or polysaccharides? So we can go ahead and go back. We want to look at what are examples of polysaccharides. So we see here on the right-hand side of the column, we see that some examples of polysaccharides would be starch, cellulose, and glycogen. They are all made up of many sugar molecules. So the best answer for this one would be C, starch, glycogen, and cellulose. And then the last question that we have from quiz 2.14 is plants store extra glucose as starch. So we know that plants store extra glucose as starch. Animals do not store it as starch. So in what form do animals' bodies store extra glucose? We know B is out, right? And we also know that sucrose is only one sugar molecule. So we're kind of torn between A and C. So let's go ahead and look at that slide that we've been looking at. How do animals and humans store glucose? And we see on the right side of the table that we store it as glycogen. So the answer to this question would be A, glycogen. So this concludes kind of the review for quiz 2.14. I would highly suggest you reading through all the review sections that I mentioned in the beginning of this presentation before taking the quiz. Remember, you are given unlimited retakes for this quiz, so just take it as many times as you need to, and your goal is to always score above a 60% because that is a passing score for this class. If you have any questions, feel free to email me for more information.